Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. If you can hear me, give me one clap. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here for our population-focused learning series on deaf and hard of hearing culture and community. This is our first series for 2020. My name is Isaac Baez, and I am the Engagement and Inclusion Coordinator, which is part of the System of Care Cultural and Linguistic Competency. We are very excited to have you all here for this special event. We have a great presentation coming up, as well as a panel discussion on the deaf and hard of hearing culture and community. We are currently recording this session and will be posting it on StarkMHAR's YouTube channel. If you still need a copy of the presentation, Carrie, who is in the back right now, will have a copy for you. The Inclusion Toolkit has also been updated and has the previous training sessions on our website. The Population-Focused Learning Series will also have 2 more sessions throughout 2020. In your folders, you'll have several things: an agenda, a list with the information of the keynote speakers as well as the panelists. And since your input is important to us, there is a survey that we would like for you to fill out towards the end of the training. You may leave it on your table before you leave. There is also an index card within your folder, and we ask that if you do have a question for the panelists or even for the presentation later, please write it down on the card during the presentation or panel discussion, and some of our volunteers will collect them during our question session. All this information, as well as the presentation, will also be included on our website. This training session will help you understand the culture of deaf and hard of hearing community and some of their history. This training will include CEUs. We hope that this information will help you understand the community to its fullest. And let me introduce the speaker. Actually, all right, I have the honor to introduce you John Moore. He is the Deaf and Services Center Incorporated, an organization that empowers those who face with the communication barriers by promoting full and equal access to communication. Headquartered in Central Ohio with satellite offices serving the northwest and southeast areas of the state, DSC is the largest provider of services for the deaf and hard of hearing and deafblind in Ohio. At DSC, Mr. Moore is responsible for overseeing the agencies and ensuring that fair and appropriate services are being provided through advocacy, education, and the provision of communication services. Some of the programs that are provided at DSC are interpreting services for American Sign Language and spoken language, captioning services, case management, employment support and translation services, youth programming, sign language instruction, early intervention services, equipment needs, and cultural competency education. Mr. Moore has filled a number of roles in various capacities to further partnerships with like-minded agencies and organizations. He has been involved in various deafness and disability organizations on local, state, and national level. His work on statewide mental health standard has been invaluable in helping to raise standards of mental health services provided to deaf and hard of hearing individuals. He has utilized his skills and ability to foster partnerships for a statewide camp for the deaf, a summer youth work with experience programs to enact vital policy changes on the state and local levels. Mr. Moore's involvement in these and other organizations over the years has given him an extensive range of experience in dealing with organizations, agencies, and interest groups on the state and local levels. I would like for us to give a round of applause for John Moore.
Good morning, everyone. I have no need for this microphone, so I'm going to scoot it to the side. It's going to bother me, so I'm scooting it over. So this morning I want to thank everyone for having me here today, and I really appreciate being here in Canton, Ohio, home of the Football Hall of Fame. So today, our objectives for learning will be what you see here on the PowerPoint. We're going to be learning about deaf culture and what that means. We're going to be learning about communication accessibility and how that plays out for deaf and hard of hearing individuals, American Sign Language and its history. Also the best strategies in providing access. How do you work with deaf and hard of hearing people? When you meet them, how do you provide the best service? And because not all individuals are the same. Also, providing the best services, the best services for the mental health needs of the individuals. And there are different approaches to accomplish that. And we'll talk more about that particular point later. Really, the deaf community is very vibrant, a very vibrant culture. They have language, and you see the sign language, and there are many deaf people who use sign language, and which we call that American Sign Language. And there are also other groups that are often oppressed, that are ostracized, or oppressed, and those groups that are sort of put to the side, and so I want to show you that there's a difference in the general population. For example, how many of you have read articles or have read for example, Greek philosopher or Greek philosophy? How many of you are familiar with those? Anyone? So this individual is one of the first people who actually oppressed deaf people, who said that deaf people cannot talk, so therefore they are incapable of rationalization or reasoning, which means that the deaf person can't think, essentially, right? And that's the assumption, correct? Based on that statement. What do you think? Is that what that sounds like to you all? Yeah. What do you think? And really, it should be no, I mean, as far as it's not a true statement. Deaf people, of course, can think. I mean, deaf people are able to reason. The article says that fact, indeed. Deaf people have performances, deaf clubs, a variety of visual poetry. We have agencies, advocacy groups, and so on. And that belongs to the particular group we call deaf culture, or the deaf community. I know when you think of culture, you think of food, sort of language. Culture means that you have the same norms or shared norms. Those are some ideas about culture. So let's just sort of compare here. You see on the PowerPoint, we've got one side that says deaf, one side that says hearing. And the first point is that it says deaf people can be very direct with their responses. So let's say, for example, there's a 25-year reunion. And of course, people don't look the same after 25 years. Maybe you haven't seen that person since high school. Maybe in high school there was a fellow who was pretty buff, football player, pretty muscular. Of course, 25 years later, and when you see them, what do they look like? Maybe belly, balding head, right? I mean, that happens. Well, if a hearing person would be in that situation, they would just look at the individual, the former buff football player, and say, "How are you? Nice to see you." But a deaf person may say, "What happened to you? You're bald, you're fat, where's that beer belly coming from?" That sort of thing. So that's the difference between the deaf and hearing culture. It's nothing personal, it's just a cultural aspect. Also, deaf people must look you in the face or in the eye, and so sometimes people are saying, "Why is that person staring at me? Why do they continue to look at me?" And oftentimes a deaf person is trying to read your lips, trying to understand what's being said, and so obviously they need to look pretty intently, but sometimes people don't understand that aspect. And it makes many hearing people, or rather that hearing people don't tend to stare at each other in the face, if you will. That's how they feel. They can do other tasks while listening. So also touch to get attention. You can touch an individual gently on the shoulder. You wouldn't shake them, but you wave in front of their face, hello, hello, just to get an individual's attention. Compared to hearing people, they'll say, hey, come here, I need you. So there's that difference between the two. Another difference is that deaf people will tend to, when they meet other individuals, they'll say, "Oh, hi, how are you?" And they will give people a hug. Hearing people will tend to fist bump, shake hands, but not hug. Deaf people do not consider themselves disabled. Sure, they can't hear, but everything else, they're able to do everything else. So what's really stopping us from doing anything? So, but I'm telling you that in the Canton area, in 1926, 27, something like that, there was a deaf semi-pro team, actually, football team. And they won the championship, for the local championship. And at that time, football players said, "Wait a minute, how does that happen? How do they do that?" Well, because they can do anything. Now, hearing people look at deaf people and consider them disabled. They need to have surgery. They need to have cochlear implants. Deaf or hearing people try to make us seem normal, quote unquote, but there's nothing wrong with us. So, and that, again, is just some generalities and attitudes of people.
And language and communication is very important. And that provides us full access, which is very important. Remember that 90% of communication happens audially. So remember that. It depends on if you're listening to music or someone talk or listening to the news. For example, while you're driving, maybe you're listening to the news. Maybe you're listening to sports. Maybe you're listening to an audiobook. When I drive, what am I doing? I can't hear. Can I read a book while I drive at the same time? I wouldn't be here. I would probably be in a hospital somewhere. So that's just an example. And the language of deaf people is called American Sign Language. And remember, now we have a bigger problem in the country where we're working with Jack and a lot of other people that has language deprivation. And what does that mean? That means growing up, they didn't get the language that they needed to fully function independently. And so they come to us for help. But understand, like, they don't know how to take care of an apartment, how to go about buying a vehicle, how to basic budget. They don't know a lot of life skills because they didn't have a basis of language to understand those things. Because growing up, a lot of them, they didn't get that communicated to them. The focus was on auditory and vocalizing because hearing people wanted them to seem normal. And it's great for some are successful with it, but then there's others that aren't. Like in Ken, you have Triad and DSC, and we've been trying to deal with that and advocate for that. And also, when you're working in mental health services, there's a difference between language deprivation and disfluency. Language deprivation, that means that the person is as smart as anyone else, but they didn't learn to read or write until they were 12, 13 years old. Imagine if none of you learned to read or write until you were in middle school. What would happen to you? It would be a struggle to catch up, right? And it's the same thing. Disfluency is not about language. It's about capability to learn. And they're far behind, and it's a struggle to catch back up. And studies show that 67% of families with deaf children does not communicate with those children. Imagine if your mom or dad wouldn't talk to you. They didn't know how to talk to you. And how would that make you feel? And that's 67% of what deaf kids go through. And then like a lot of statements, deaf people growing up and hearing families, they were the only deaf person. And oftentimes it's like, hold on, what'd you say? What'd you want me to do? And it's like, oh, don't worry about it. I'll tell you later. And that's often the response they get. For example, a friend of mine, it was quite different for me because my parents were deaf. So I had full access to communication growing up. I started to read and write as early as I needed to, but a lot of deaf people, over 90%, are born to hearing parents, and oftentimes they have no idea what to do with the deaf children. And you'll see that again and again, and I'll touch more on that later. And they hear that often. And something you should never tell a deaf person, when they say that, the deaf person tends to get upset because they want full accessibility to the communication as everyone else. Accessibility. Sign language interpreters. Like I have my sign language interpreters. Can you all understand me? Without an interpreter, could you all understand me? No. So imagine if I told the interpreters to leave, but I'm going to continue the presentation. How would you all feel? You would be lost, right? And then you have CART, and it's captioning, and that's why some deaf and hard of hearing people don't sign, and it depends on the words. They depend on the printed words. And then caption phones, like CapTel phones, you can see the words going across while you're talking. You can read the words, but you can't hear it, but you want to continue talking. And oftentimes people, they lose their hearing ability. And then closed captioning in all forms So like, let me tell you, 5 years ago, my kids, they were on YouTube. And they're having fun, they're having a great time, and I look and there's no captioning on the video. And I have 4 hearing kids, mind you. So I'm just like, what are they talking about? And so my kid's like, you know, what's wrong with YouTube? But now most YouTube videos are captioned today. And so I can follow along if I watch one because times has changed for the accessibility. And then flashing lights and Duo. It's a machine, and it's almost like a typewriter when you used to talk back and forth. And my financial officer couldn't sign, so we communicated a lot with this device. If we didn't have an interpreter available to us, or if we wanted to have a private conversation about personal things and didn't want an interpreter to be a part of that, that's what we used to communicate. And these are just basic things that just helps accessibility become more accessible. And I'm going to teach you a new word today you probably never heard of. Autism. It focuses on your ability to hear and speak. But really it's the perspective of what's better or superior than other forms of communication as far as, you know, people that can hear and talk. And the bottom line is, like, if you were to come to me and try to chat with me, and then someone else comes up and starts talking to you, your eyes are going to go from me to them because they can talk to you right in the middle of us communicating. But why did that happen? Because you can hear them. Or if I'm talking with Laura right here and we're signing to each other, and then someone else, a hearing person, comes up to us,
Hey, John.
we're going to...
John, how are you?
You're not going to really understand, and that's autism. That's oppression of communication. And often, it's intentional of us, it's unintentional of us to oppress communication with someone else. Autism, it happens every day. It happens to all of us. So that word, keep it in the front of your mind when you're working with deaf and hard of hearing people, because that is part of the issue, and that causes issues with deaf and hard of hearing individuals. It makes them uneasy, it causes frustration and depression, and a lot of it is related to autism. Any questions? You didn't have enough coffee this morning? So when you're working with a deaf person or meeting with a deaf person, it's very important to know this list. Look at them in their eyes when you're communicating with them. Don't look away, look them in their eyes, and that's very important. Don't cover your mouth while you're speaking to them. Let me tell you, my son, he's involved in the choir at school. And so they do parades and marching band and things like that. And the teacher has a microphone, but it's covering their mouth. I can't read their lips. So I'm just not understanding what's going on, or they're talking while their back is to me, and all I can see is the back of their bald head. I can't see what they're saying. So make sure that when you're communicating with a deaf person, you keep eye contact, and that's very important. Include the deaf person in the conversation. Like at these tables you guys are sitting at, if a deaf person's sitting there, oftentimes people are talking and it's easy, you're chatting and you're not really thinking about it. But that deaf person is sitting there and has no clue what's going on. They're lost, so make sure that you include them, don't ignore them. And it's very important for the deaf person to know where their interpreter is supposed to be and not to guess. Or to ask the deaf person where they want the interpreter to be. As the interpreter doesn't voice for me, then it's a struggle while they're interpreting to follow a new presenter or what's going on. Just want to let you guys know, and I commend my interpreters for doing the best that they can. And that's why I say that. I went to a conference, and it was fine, it was exciting to go, and at the table I was sitting at, I'm sitting here, and guess where the interpreter was? Sitting right next to me. And my interpreters are in front of me, which is great. And the presentation is in front of us, but they're next to me. It's like, no, don't tell them that their interpreter should be next to them when they need to be in front of the deaf person. And it's like, oh, okay. Don't let the deaf, always let the deaf person decide where they need their interpreter. Mental health and deafness. You all work in mental health and addiction services, and you all provide a very important service. But in Ohio, mental health services for the deaf and hard of hearing, it's not that great. And there's a lot of room for improvement with that. Really, communication is key. Remember that. We need to have open and clear communication for a therapist or counselor or a psychiatrist with their deaf clients to be successful. Without communication, we can't find out the diagnosis. And sign language interpreters, many people get confused about an interpreter's role. Sign language interpreting is part of the treatment team, and they have to be a part of that. Some therapists, some psychiatrists think that interpreters aren't necessary, they're not part of the team, but they are, because they're going to be the ones to help facilitate communication and make that successful between their clients and themselves. So they need the interpreter to be able to help, because they're not going to know sign language most of the time. And really, when you all have an interpreter as part of the treatment team, do not switch out interpreters. Use the same interpreter every meeting with that client. The interpreter becomes part of the treatment team. So let me ask you, how would you feel if you went to a therapist every week, and every week you had a different therapist? Would you like that? It's the same thing. Keep the same interpreter. That deaf person is going to go and spill their guts out about what they're going through and what they're dealing with, and if they go back a week later and it's a different interpreter, and then a therapist is trying to have a session with them, all of a sudden a deaf person seems completely better. because they're not comfortable going through that kind of stuff with a new interpreter. They haven't built that trust, which is very important. In the community, you have to build trust, and that's why you should use the same interpreter. And that's the best approach. And don't forget your body language, your facial expressions, and your gestures. And the interpreter might say something one way when the deaf client means something a different way. Like sometimes I'm looking with this look on my face. What do you think that means? Why do I have this look on my face? No, I'm just thinking. I'm not mad. This would be mad. So you have to be careful with people and their assumptions. Deaf people are very expressive, and a lot of that is shown on our face during communication. So the interpreter is helping to identify what the expression is and what it means, and that's why it's important for you all to understand that. Any questions before I move on? Okay.
You had up there about over-medication. Can you say something about over-medication?
Oh, yes. Thank you for bringing that up. So, for example, like over-medication in mental health happens pretty often, especially when there's limited communication and you can't really get to the bottom of the questions, and you think that they're depressed, so you give them Prozac or Zoloft or lithium, and you're giving them this medication, and then all of a sudden they're feeling off. Maybe they didn't need that. And the frustration is that they seem like something they're not, but you give them a medication for something they don't need. And a lot of time with deaf clients, they're over-medicated. And then that medicine, in the medical field, that happens often with doctors trying to fix a problem instead of getting to the root of the problem. Did that help?
Yes.
Any other questions? Okay. So how do you address that? We are part of an important team. It's not any one person that controls everything. We're all a part of the team. And need to know what resources are available to help you provide the best accessibility to your deaf patients, your deaf clients. And you need to make sure that you reach out to know what resources are available. Like here in Canton, we have Triad. Triad can help. And they're here, they're a local resource in this community for the deaf. And they have the resources and can provide you the cultural appropriation services with the deaf clients and patients in this area. And the bottom line is that it's an important need for deaf people to be able to communicate and have an environment of accessible communication to provide the services necessary. And then the deaf person can get full accessibility to the services just like any other client. And that's the goal. Right now, you are learning about this. And make sure you keep it in the forefront of your brain anytime that you need something in this area. Jack Laura and Triad, they can help with that. And 89% of the population of deaf and hard of hearing individuals one out of 11 people, or 1 out of 10, has some kind of hearing loss. And that means that out of all of you, not counting myself and Laura, maybe at least 5 or 6 of you will lose your hearing and become deaf. You don't have to raise your hand, but it's like you might have yourself or a family member that has degenerative hearing loss, and it happens. It might be work-related, it might be a generational thing, genetic thing. And I have a story to share real quick. About 15 years ago, a woman showed up in my office. And she was talking to me, and she realized I couldn't hear. She started writing with me back and forth. She had used to work for a call center, you know, wearing the headsets, but she had gotten fired because she couldn't hear anymore. So what happened? She was 38 years old, and she woke up one morning. Her husband was talking to her, but all she could hear was quietness. Children were yelling, all she could hear was quietness. She couldn't hear anything. And the family screaming at her, and she couldn't hear. She had lost all of her hearing overnight. It was very tough on her. And that can be tough on your family. And to make it through that, she had to find a different job. It can happen to any of them. Okay, 1 in 5 people will need or receive mental health services in their lifetime. That's the statistics for the nation. The government, what is the government?
Governor DeWine.
Governor DeWine, last week, from a study. And in the deaf community, that number is higher. Language deprivation, stereotyping, and oppression increases that number amongst the deaf. And then you have labeling, and you should ask the deaf person how they want to be labeled. And people call us hearing impaired. It's like, so hearing impaired, does that mean that all hearing people are deaf impaired? Impaired implies that we aren't fully functioning, that we have lesser capability than anyone else. So that word is not appropriate to use. Hearing challenged or hearing handicapped, those words are a no-no. Deaf, latent deaf, deaf blind, or hard of hearing, those are a lot more acceptable terms. And growing up deaf, that's how I was often labeled, so I wanted to share with you what that does and how that feels. Any questions?
Can you say something about aging and loss of hearing?
Sure. Now, it can be different because with a deaf or hard of hearing person, they grew up with that. So they grew up in deaf community and taking part in deaf culture. But for a hearing person, that happen to later in their life, they feel isolated and they don't join deaf culture. And like, for example, like the woman I was talking about, a 38-year-old woman that lost her hearing overnight, right? She was heartbroken because she couldn't communicate with her husband, she couldn't communicate with her kids like she used to be able to. And she had to find a different career. It was really tough. And then we have a president of a company, huge business in Columbus. He's a very wealthy person. He drives a Tesla, has a huge, beautiful mansion, part of the country club. But he experienced hearing loss, and now he's deaf at 65. And he got a cochlear implant, and he got a hearing aid, and it's been a struggle for him to communicate like he used to be able to. And 9 out of 10 of the friends he used to have and socialize with, they don't talk to him anymore. Their reply was, "Oh, it's too much work trying to talk to you." And so they just pushed him aside. But it's like, but we were friends for like 30 years. And it's like, nah, forget him. It causes depression, frustration, and anger, but it happens. And that's the difference.
So then, for people in mental health, is it likely that they will see more people who are older, who have experienced a loss of hearing in their mental health clientele?
Well, it'll vary. It depends on the population center and the area, with the ages of the people and their place in the community, if they're retired or not, and those factors all vary. Like in Columbus, there's more of a deaf culture of deaf people that grew up in the culture because we have a school for the deaf there, and the deaf kids go to school there. And so the answer depends on where you worked or where you live or what you do. And as far as counseling services in Florida, they might have a lot of older people who went through hearing loss gradually throughout their life. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Anyone else? Anything else? She's like the only person that's been asking questions. You don't have to be shy.
What about the younger children being identified, they're not speaking in school? How do we get our parents involved in helping them with the child, first with the child that's deaf?
Well, that is a challenge sometimes, and Ohio has early intervention programs, but it's not very successful. And oftentimes the providers don't fully understand the deafness, and the parents often don't understand, aren't getting all of the information. Because as that kid grows up, there's 4, 5, 6 years old, maybe they're not developing language like they should be because of that language deprivation. And so then they start to get frustrated with not being able to communicate. And it's how can we as therapists can get that information if that child hasn't been able to develop language. So it's twofold. You have to educate the parents and refer to appropriate resources and help that child develop the language that they need to get the support and services in the best way they can from us. So let me tell you about a statistic. So like with DSC in Columbus, I run an early childhood intervention program. And only half of the families come to us for services. The other half, they don't. They feel like they don't need it. They feel like they're fine. So half of the children that are deaf don't have parents that understand their situation. Understand?
I have another question. What about people that speak another language when a child is deaf?
And that's a challenge as well. Like, for example, my daughter in school, her class had a deaf kid whose parents moved from Mexico. And the parents only spoke Spanish. And this kid, this boy, he was learning English in ASL. He didn't know any Mexican or Spanish. So what happened was the school provided 2 interpreters, an ASL interpreter and a Spanish interpreter. And sometimes the Spanish interpreter wasn't available, and so the boy's younger sister, who was probably about 8, and this kid was 11, who knew Spanish and English and ASL, had to interpret for him. So speak Spanish to mom and dad and speak ASL to him, and it was a very interesting family dynamic. And the problem with the therapy was that the family's therapist needed an ASL interpreter, a Spanish interpreter, and I'll tell you that Ohio doesn't really have any trilingual interpreters that can speak Spanish, English, and ASL. In Florida, there are some. So just keep that in mind.
With inclusion being a big focus now, are there any, legislation efforts being made to make American Sign Language a part of the curriculum for kids so that way the deaf community doesn't feel isolated?
The only thing that we have, which is requiring ASL, is recognized as a foreign language. That's it. It's not being part of education programs or part of the IEP process, individual education plan. We're trying to push that with the communication, but it's not required in the IEP process, but it should be. We have a lot of work to do here in Ohio, but the good news is DSC, Cleveland Hearing and Speech Center, and other community centers for the deaf in Ohio are working together with the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services to develop video trainings modules that are 8-hour trainings on how to work with deaf and hard of hearing mental health patients. And that's a development process, and we're hoping that it's ready to roll out by next year. It took us all 8 years for the Department of Mental Health to convince the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services to get that rolling.
What about clients that are dual diagnosed, meaning not only do they have mental health, but they're hard of hearing, and they also suffer from a developmental disability as well? So I work with clients that have developmental disabilities at my other job, and I can communicate enough to get by so that he can understand what I'm saying and I understand what he's saying. But are there any programs to promote that type of communication when they've got all three of them hitting them?
And that's a great question. In Ohio, not really. But when I worked in Mississippi, Massachusetts, I lived there for a while. I worked in a group home with DD clients who were deaf, and I managed 5 houses. And they had a lot of issues, such as sometimes there wasn't enough interpreters, and we had to get some deaf advocacy, and we had to make picture books to communicate their feelings and help them to be able to expand on things from the picture books, and that seemed like the best approach for us. So maybe that's something you could try. Anyone else?
My daughter is 16. She's taking American Sign Language in high school. She's very passionate. She's also interested in being a social worker. What advice would you have for her?
Yes. That is really awesome that your daughter wants to be a social worker and has an interest in ASL. I definitely commend that. But there's not enough people who works in mental health that can sign fluently. And I think that is very important for your daughter to go to the right schools to be able to best develop both skills as a social worker and with her interest in sign language, to understand sign language and deaf culture, go through an interpreting program, and then she can take courses in both fields at the same time, and then contact local agencies to be able to provide that service for deaf and hard of hearing individuals. And that would help her signing and her understanding of the deaf and hard of hearing culture a lot better and be able to best provide that service. And that's just my advice to start off. Okay, so my time is up. Any more questions before I'm done? Oh, they say keep going, so I'll keep going. So right now I want to tell you a story about deaf culture.
When I had gone to the doctor's office, I walked in and there was an interpreter. And then the appointment was finished, and then the doctor said, hey, to the interpreter, speaking to the interpreter, hey, thank you so much for driving John here today. And the interpreter, of course, wanted to, but this interpreter was a friend of mine. I said, hey, that's okay, it's okay. And I said, and at that time it was 4:30 in the day, and it was on a Friday at 4:30, and the office was going to be closing soon. So I walked out into the parking lot, and I waited a few minutes. The doctor came out from the office, and I said, hello. He said, hi, John, or whatever. So then got in his car and started and drove off. And I got my car and started it and drove off, and the doctor looked at me like, huh? John got in a car and drove off? Yeah, that's one thing. Let me give you another story. I had applied for individual insurance. I was working at that time for a very small agency in South Carolina, and I was the only person who was full-time, so I applied for the insurance. So I applied in this one particular company, and they turned me down instantly. They denied my claim, and they said, oh, you have a pre-existing condition, so you're denied. And I was young at the time, 27, and I had no health problems whatsoever. I never had any serious surgeries, nothing. I mean, I was the picture of health. And so I thought, what pre-existing conditions? What are you talking about? So I called the insurance company, and I said, excuse me, what exactly are my pre-existing conditions? And they said, well, first of all, your voice box is broken, and we're not going to pay to repair that. Your ears are broken, and we won't fix that either. I thought to myself, my voice box is just fine, and I just never learned how to speak properly because I have my hearing loss. So it's not, my voice box is not broken, and I don't want my ears to be quote unquote fixed. My parents are deaf. I grew up this way. It doesn't bother me at all. I'm perfectly fine. And so, of course, I just look for different insurance. But that was interesting. The other thing, you know Sears, everyone's familiar with Sears, and of course, back in the day, that was the place to purchase a washer and dryer, really, or any appliances. And they had wonderful credit cards there, and you could get like 6 months no interest when you purchased an appliance back in the day. And, or that's what it is now, but back then, it wasn't anything like that. I love those 6 months. You can get them paid off quickly. But anyways, I had gone in and I was getting ready to make a purchase. I was approved for the department, the credit card at the time, and it was in Atlanta, Georgia. And so I had waited for them to come back with my approval, but they came back and said that I was denied. And I said, well, wait a minute. I'm denied because I'm deaf? So I asked, I said, well, do you have hearing? I have hearing family members. Does that count? And so I'll just get them to apply for the. They said you can get them to apply for the credit card if you have hearing family members. And I said, well, why? No, I'm not going to do that. But it took me 2 hours with them going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Went up to the supervisor, and then that supervisor, finally all the way up to the top before I got approved. And that was 2 hours. I could have been doing something else. And that was a definite attitudinal barrier there, obviously. I mean, we deaf people face that kind of thing, though, every day. And people of color face the similar kinds of barriers. And individuals in different genders face that sort of barrier as well. I mean, I'm deaf, so mine might look a little differently than others, but let me ask you, how many times have you gone to Walmart, for example? How many times have you gone to Walmart, you see a person in Walmart, and you think, that cashier should be a little faster because of their skin color, because of their gender? I mean, a lot of people do that, even today. They'll look and they'll think, oh, I'll go through that line, or that's a white girl, she's a little faster. Or I'll go over here to this person for this reason or what. That's not really true. It doesn't matter who that person is. Some people are faster, some people aren't. Now, I have one last story to leave you with. I worked at Domino's Pizza one time, and I like Domino's Pizza. Any of you like Domino's pizza? Do any of you like Domino's? Do you order Domino's? Nobody here likes Domino's, huh? Anyone? No? Several? Yes? No? Okay. Well, I worked there for 4 months, and I was 19 at the time. So I showed up, and they said, can you work? And I said, yeah, absolutely. I showed up to work, and they said, no, wait a minute. You can't hear because you can't hear. You have to be on the phone because you're not going to be able to answer the phone and take the orders. And I said, well, wait a minute. I can make pizza. I can deliver pizzas. I can clean up. I can open and close. And there are a huge list of things that I can do. And so I thought, oh, just one reason I can't hear? Okay, fine. So I told them, I said, I'll tell you what. Let me do this for you. I'll work for you for 1 week free. I'll keep the tips. Just for gas money. If you like me after 1 week, great. Then you pay me for the work. If you don't like me, tell me to get out. How about that? They thought about it. Okay. They said, fine. They agreed to the deal. They said, go ahead, start working. So I did. I worked 5 days, and 5 days later, what happened? They said, calm down, John. You can stay. You're a good worker. Just stay. And then, after 4 months, I quit. Because I went back to school, I wanted to finish my college degree. And they said, oh, no. Wait, we're going to promote you. We're going to make you assistant manager. Just stay, please. Please, just stay. Oh, no, wait. I've got a new sports car, and, it's a fancy, it's beautiful. That's yours if you stay through Christmas.
Wow.
And they were like dangling that carrot out to me, please stay. And I thought, how interesting that 4 months ago they didn't even want to hire me. Now they're begging me to stay. That's just another example of that attitudinal barrier.
Assumption because they label.
And it was assumption that they made because they had put a label on me. We, as professionals, cannot make assumptions. We cannot make assumptions about people. We have to meet people where they are and find out who they really are and work with them. Right? Okay? Thank you so much for having me here today. Appreciate it. Again, you can ask me any questions afterwards. Meet me, I'll be around. Thank you.
I'm going to now ask for the panelists to come and sit up. You want to? Yeah. Okay. We're going to have some live movement right now, so I do apologize.
I'm the only one that gets the microphone, apparently, because I'm the only one that's hearing up here versus my 3 colleagues who are deaf. HELLOEVRYONE GLADYUYOU DEAFBLIND CULTUREAND OUR DAYLIFAV ADVACACY THANYOU. How many of you understood what I was saying? I run into a lot of first of all, I'm Jack Hawk. I'm the director of Triad Deaf Services. I'm a CODA, child of a deaf adult. I run into a lot of people, providers, saying, "We have our own staff person here who can sign for the deaf person." I says, "Really?" Yeah, they learn finger spelling. What I just did is finger spelling. All I did was I spelled out everything. Deaf people understood that, but we don't talk like that. We don't talk like finger spelling, and that is not an effective. This is all about access to effective communications, and the key word there is effective communications. I'll do another little thing here. Hello. You here learn HOH, culture, advocacy, you. Now, what I was saying there was, hello everyone, glad you came here, learn deaf, hard of hearing, deaf blind, culture, and our day of life of advocacy. Thank you. The other side of the thing is people say, oh, we can read lips. Now, I'm a coda. When I sign, I tend not to move my lips. John, when he was signing, he moved his lips. So some of you could grab some of that. 35 to 40% of lip reading is what is grasped. Can you imagine losing 2/3 of the conversation when you talk to someone? That's what I was trying to just do there for a minute.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt. I'm going to give the introduction to everyone here so that way.
I'm sorry. This is what happens when you're at CODA. You're deaf and blunt and you jump into things.
Thanks, everyone. So if I would like to remind, if you do have your index cards, please write your questions down. Ramel is going to be helping me collect the cards, and I'm going to ask Max as well to help out on this side. So if you lift up your card, someone will come by and pick them up and bring them forward. We do ask for you to ask as much questions as possible so that way you can get most of the information from our 4 guests that we have here. And I'm going to read their bio real quickly just to give their introduction. We had the honor already of introducing John Moore, who is the CEO and Executive Director of Deaf Services Center. And thank you, John, for such an amazing presentation, by the way. That was really great. And now we will introduce Laura Proudfoot. So Program and Interpreter Coordinator for Triad Deaf Services Incorporated. Laura wears many different hats in her role at Triad Deaf Services Incorporated. Her dual degrees from Stark State came in handy when she landed her job 6 years ago at Triad. Triad is a nonprofit. Laura has a hand in nearly every aspect in the business, from accounting to pre-employment transition services. She serves over 500 deaf beings in Stark, Tuscarawas, and Carroll County. She interacts with deaf and hearing fluently. Her interpreters love her, and the deaf look up to her. Next, we have the honor of Jack Hawk, who is the Director, CFO of Triad Deaf Services Incorporated. Jack is a CODA, child of deaf adult, oldest of 4 hearing siblings, born and raised in a deaf culture. He is a licensed practicing architect where he has designed housing and nursing facilities for the deaf and deafblind, and particularly at Columbus Colony in Westville, Ohio. 8 years ago, he became director of Triad Deaf Services Incorporated, a community center for the deaf under Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities, serving over 500 deaf and hard of hearing and deafblind in Stark, Tuscarawas, and Carroll counties. He is a member of Ohio Association for the Deaf as chair of the Financial Review Committee. He is the sponsorship chair for the upcoming 150th anniversary of the Ohio School for the Deaf Alumni Association, and it is a committee member for Ohio Citizens for Deaf Culture. He has been the past president of several local civic and professional organizations, such as the Canton Museum of Art and statewide American Institute of Architects of Ohio. And last but not least, Eileen Rishut, MSW and community member. Eileen has an MSW specializing in addiction and mental health services. She has over 20 years of experience and has worked in 3 states with a variety of deaf people in her career. Eileen has been in Ohio for 5 years and has seen the tremendous difference throughout the state for deaf people, especially with the availability of qualified interpreters. She looks forward to seeing the improvement of mental health qualities for the deaf community. And again, I would like for us to give them another applause. Awesome. So I'm going to start with our first question, and then if you have other questions, you can start bringing them up. But my first question is going to go to John Moore. Throughout your professional journey, what is one thing you have seen as an assumption about the community that you would like for anyone to be aware of?
Well, I can't say that there's just one, but during my presentation, the attitudinal barriers, that's one of the biggest assumptions. The attitudinal barriers is an assumption on the deaf people being of lower intelligence or functioning just because they can't hear or don't talk. And that's one of the biggest assumptions, that they can't work, or we can't read or write, or maybe we're developmentally disabled, and none of those things are accurate. Really, we're very intelligent and we're very capable people that can do just anything, but we just communicate differently. And the only thing wrong is if you look in our ears, you just have to...
Two out-of-order signs.
It's 2 out-of-order signs. And that's it.
Thank you. All right, our next question is for Laura. What are some key pieces of advice that you would like for everyone to know when working with an ASL interpreter?
John Moore mentioned some of them. The deaf person who died where John Moore mentioned some of them. The deaf person who died where the interpreter did allow them to position the interpreter with easy ability. Normally they sit next to the psychiatrist or the counselor or the social worker. We don't like to be turning our head a lot if the interpreter's over here. That's not effective. Ask the deaf person who their preferred interpreter is. When it's counseling, again, use the same interpreter every time. Don't switch, if possible. We appreciate a week's notice. We get booked 2 or 3 weeks in advance. So the sooner, the better. The sooner, the better, because our interpreters are very busy. Again, we serve 500 deaf people in the area. So, they have doctor's appointments and other things to do. So, always, I find it easier, instead of making the appointment with the deaf person and calling us with the date, it's better to call us first, find out when the interpreter is available, then schedule the appointment with the deaf person. So there's not a whole lot of back and forth. Keep an open mind and treat us as equal. We're just like you.
Great. All right, so our next question is going to be for Jack. Can you share with us what is Triad and how can we connect with you?
Triad is a CCD, Community Center for the Deaf, under the state OOD, Opportunities for Ohioans with Disability. There are 8 CCDs throughout the state of Ohio. John Moore at DSC and Triad are the only 2 CCDs that are deaf-run, deaf-operated. The others are underneath some other entity like Easter Seals or some other hearing entity. Our 2 agencies are the only 2 that are run totally by the deaf. I hire only deaf people. I'm the only hearing person. There's only 3 of us. So what does Triad do? We're located at the Goodwill campus down there on 9th Street, Southwest. You can look at our webpage, www.Triad Deaf Services, Inc. What do? We basically do interpreting services for the deaf community. We do advocacy. That is my biggest role. I can't begin to tell you how many people believe that, oh, you can bring your own interpreter. And I go, no, no, no. When you call me, this is a service for charge. You mean I have to pay for this? Yeah, because what we do is we interpret for you, the professional. We're not interpreting for the deaf person. And they just can't get that in their head. And I says, we're a part of your team. Well, we don't understand that. Okay. So you have automatic doors on your buildings. You have accessible bathrooms. These are things you paid for. So a deaf person is entitled to access to communications. And so I advocate a lot for that. Some of the biggest issues that we face are like with the hospitals. If some of you are from the hospitals, I hope you can take this back to your superiors. The hospitals believe that interpreters cost too much money. I sit there and I look at one hospital builds a $101 million building out of cash, and they can't afford in 1 year about $25,000 worth of interpreting services. They prefer to use a thing called VRS. It's like a computer screen about this big. How many of you have had kidney stones? So when you're laying on that bed doing the kidney dance, and there's this video thing here, and they're saying, you know, what's going on, that you think you're going to pay attention to this thing? Or I have a family member who is deaf, and they want to know what's going on, and all once they want to see what's going on there, and the doctors and the nurses say, go sit down. So advocacy is one of the big things that we do. The other thing that we do is support services. You can't believe how many deaf people walk into our offices with things that look official. Oh, am I being sued? No, this is some sort of insurance they want you to buy. Oh, it's junk mail. Oh, okay. We do a lot of that with a lot of deaf people. Or we have deaf people coming in saying, I'm going to get divorced. I don't know what to do. I don't have any money to hire attorneys. So we do case management. We also have a fund that if you come to me and somebody's going to turn off your electricity and you have a child, we will give you some money to put the electricity back on. The other thing is that we do leadership. And in leadership, we have ASL classes where we teach people who want to learn sign language, and we use a book there. We also have Do It Did, which is a summer program. We also get involved in trying to advocate for people to get hired. I have 3 little brochures if you want to look at them. Take one. One's about how to get interpreting. One is about employment, and one is about education. I could talk about this forever. Deaf is a 3-dimensional language. I can't get people to understand this. This is not like a foreign language where I can turn my head like John said and I could still hear what you're talking about. This is a 3-dimensional language. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. All right, I'm going to read a question from the audience. Where can we find the most thorough and effective ASL training here in Stark County area if we are just starting out?
Well, like I said, at Triad, we have classes every Saturday, 10 weeks. It's about $100 because we're a nonprofit and we haven't got anybody to help pay for that yet. You get this book, which is $20, and there are 10 classes at $8 each. It's about an hour, hour and 15, hour and 20 minutes. If you have perfect attendance, I give you back $20 and you keep the book. as an incentive. We do it 3 times a year, fall, winter, and spring. We don't do it in the summer because of everybody's vacations. Now understand something. This is just basic learning, okay? We'll have ASL classes 1, 2, and 3, so there are different fluencies as you want to stay with that. It's enough to get you started. It's like riding a bicycle. You have to remember how to ride it. After a while, you can become more fluent, and you have to keep using it. If you're not going to use it, you're going to lose it.
I would like to also add to what Jack just said. If you go through the ASL class, you will actually be, okay, you would be able, I think that you will fall in love with it. You can also go to Kent State University. They have a program there. You can learn interpreting. They have a deaf ed program there, and it's not far from this location. So, and there are also other colleges and universities in the area. There's one in Pennsylvania, but those are some other ideas.
I know that Walsh has an active program that focuses for nurses.
All right. So our next question is going to be for Eileen. So as a community member living in Canton, what are some significant concerns that you have experienced regarding mental health barriers for the community?
Okay, well, I can tell you about my experiences being a deaf mother with a hearing daughter, and that's where I've gotten most of my experience about mental health issues from. My daughter, she's now 19, but when we first moved here, she was 14. And before that, we lived in Indiana, and in Indiana, people had said that my daughter was bipolar, and I'm like, okay, well, that's fine. They had a great program, and we were used to how they did things in Indiana, and then we moved here to Canton about 5 years ago, and it was a lot different. I found out that if I wanted better mental health services for my daughter, then I had to go to Akron. Because Akron, they have one of the best programs for children at that time, because of Akron Children's Hospital. So they had good services, but now my daughter being 19, she's aged out of being able to use Akron Children's, and so I can't get those services from Akron anymore. So I don't know if any of you guys have experienced mental health and how hospitals handle it. Like, for example, Akron General Hospital, I tried to encourage my daughter at 18 to be independent and make her own decisions. And it's like, you're the one that's dealing with these things, not me. So, you know, I just have to keep advocating for my daughter because she's 19 now. She's going to be 20 in the summer, and she's still, you know, you're bipolar. You think you know everything. You think you're fine. And then next thing you know, you decide you're going to stop taking your medication. And then you have another problem, and then you're going through it again, and then you become manic. And my daughter, she's more of like an angry person. She's not that nice. Anyway, I tried to get services here at Altman Hospital, Mercy Hospital, and I wasn't happy with their services because they were just like, okay, well, she can stay here for a few hours, and if you need more services, you need more help, then you have to go to this other place. And so it's like, for example, I went to inpatient in Cleveland, and they have outpatient and they have inpatient programs too. And I'll tell you that when you have like a young adult, 18, 19, 20, it's quite different than how they handle someone that's like in their 40s. And they were putting like 18, 19-year-olds with 40, 45-year-olds, and I didn't think that was appropriate. I don't advocate for that. I think that it's a lot better to have a group for the younger adults, and that will be more appropriate for them because being around the same age, they're going to be more likely to have a lot of the same issues than people that are a lot older. And I think that, like the older adults, they've already gotten used to the system, and it's like, oh, here we go again, and they'll just choose to sleep all day. And my daughter, she's young and she's outgoing, and that's not who she is, so she didn't want to take part in that, and she said that from her experience that there was a lot better services provided when she was younger compared to when she aged out. And it's like you're just supposed to just sit there and deal with it after you age out, and it's like, okay, you know, where else can I get referrals for, you know, younger adults that are aged out of the kid programs that were so great? And I have a deaf friend of mine who lives in Cleveland, and she had put herself into a mental health hospital because she was suffering from postpartum depression after having a baby, and she noticed that there wasn't a lot of programs for dealing with that, and so she had it really bad, and she was having hallucinations and thinking that she wanted to hurt her baby and different things like that. She had all kind of issues, and they didn't provide an interpreter for her, and they should have provided an interpreter for her because she's deaf, and so she can best understand the treatment and what's going on. They didn't even ask her if she wanted an interpreter, and they didn't respect that she needed an interpreter. And they, you know, some people like the whole VRI thing and some people don't. Everyone's different. I don't like VRI myself because, like Jack said, you know, you're not gonna, that's not 100% accessibility. And if someone's deaf blind, they can't see someone on the screen like that. But the important thing is to come up with a temporary solution to get by until you can get an interpreter to a place and have a real life interpreter. And also, when you're dealing with deaf people, you have to explain things about medication and use terminology that, you know, they're most likely not going to understand. And then, you know, it's hard to see if a deaf person understands you. And, oh, did you want to say something? And really that the deaf people have to really analyze, and me, I wear glasses, so I have 4 eyes, and anyway, for example, like my fiance, he doesn't like VRI, and he doesn't like interpreters, so when he has to go to the hospital, he'll tell the hospital, don't call me for me an interpreter, because he doesn't like interacting with interpreters, because he doesn't want someone that isn't good enough for him. And they don't have a law here in Ohio to make sure that all interpreters are certified, and that can be frustrating because I moved here from Indiana, and when I lived in that state, you know, certified interpreters were required, and here they're not. And there's only a few states that require interpreters to be certified. So imagine if you needed to have someone that is proficient in your language to make sure you fully understood words and things like that, and be able to explain to you what's wrong and make sure things don't go over your head. And it's really frustrating, especially when they give you a medication and they tell you you have to take it 4 times a day. And, you know, you take one pill at 11 and one at 3, and if I don't have a good enough interpreter and then I get confused about how I'm supposed to take this medication, that could be dangerous for me or someone, you know, and that can cause more problems or death ultimately. And I think Laura wanted to say something.
I wanted to share a story. I have 4 children. I went through a custody battle because of a divorce. One of the things that was required is the psychiatric evaluation of me and my ex-husband, which is normal in divorce proceedings. So I went to my psychological evaluation. They had just taken my kids away from me the night before. So I was emotional, and I chose not to speak. I chose to sign because I worry about my volume and, stuff like that, because I can't hear myself. I'm deaf, 100% deaf. I can't hear anything. So I did my psychological evaluation. He asked a lot of personal questions, and as a deaf person, I would show him my expressing how I felt, and all this stuff. So the next morning, you have our emergency court for placement, where they're going to put the kid. Normal procedure. So they spoke about my psychological evaluation. I was deemed mentally retarded, flapping my hands inconsistently, couldn't control my behavior. I was diagnosed horribly. That is the discrimination that deaf people get, just because we speak differently. So please keep an open mind.
I'd like to add to that. When you have an interpreter, oftentimes doctors will say, oh, you can bring a family member, or you can bring a friend. You need to have somebody who is neutral, and that's what the interpreter is. I had a case where the doctor called me and said, I need to have you come in, and the son of this person said, oh, no, I do my dad's interpreting, you don't need to go. And I said, nope, doctor says I gotta go. So we went in there, we sat there, and the doctor told this gentleman that he had cancer. And in the course of me signing, he would not focus on me, and I said, doctor, can you hold on for a minute? I says, you're not focusing on me, what's going on? And he says, am I gonna die? And the doctor said, no, we've caught it early enough, we need to just go through what the options are. Stepping outside, now the son was with me, stepping outside, the son said, I'm glad you were here because I would have lied to my father. And most people would do that because they want to protect their parents. So you need to have somebody who is neutral, and I can't begin to tell you how important it is to have that interpreter. And in the state of Ohio, we just recently passed a law where when you're pulled over as a deaf person, your license plates is put into the computer. So when a deaf person is pulled over and the state patrol walks up to you, you start flapping your hands and they think they're being threatened. But now they can see the license plates and know that, okay, I either have an autistic or a deaf, or I have somebody that I have to concern myself with.
And I want to add to what Jack said. I want to share another experience with you guys. There's several hospitals that get sued for, providers that get sued for not providing interpreters. In Arizona, there's a kid that's about 9 or 10 years old and had a deaf mom. And they went to an oncologist, and the doctor told the kid to interpret for the mom. Tell her that she has this type of cancer and she has 6 months left to live. And the boy said, Mom, you're gonna die. Why are you gonna die? That's all the boy said, because he was confused and he got emotional and couldn't properly relay the message. So that's why it's important to provide a qualified interpreter, especially when you're dealing with those kind of situations. And another thing related to communication and disability law, in 2018, it's a wonderful law because a friend of mine was pulled over and he was trying to talk. Because, you know, a deaf person's voice may sound like a person's been drinking, and the cop assumed that my friend was drunk and ordered him to get out the car. And he said, "This is your beer can on the road." And he's like, "No, that's not mine. I haven't been drinking." And immediately they grabbed him and handcuffed him, pushed him against the into the car, and ended up breaking his thumb. And when he went to the county jail, the sheriff looked and didn't think he had been drinking, so he went to try to communicate, and he's like, "He's nothing wrong. He's not drunk. He's just deaf. Let him go." And the officer that arrested him thought that he was drunk. And so that's another kind of assuming. And then if you have a family member that can sign or different kind of accents, people make assumptions that are often wrong, and that needs to stop through appropriate cultural training and legislation. And I want to add to what he said. Do you guys know about the law about diversity? For example, if you go to court and you have like a black or white client and their interpreter is the opposite, and they might be from a different culture or a different area, and so you think that everyone that can sign signs the same, but you've got people from a lot of different places that learn how to sign and they come here or move here, and you just have to be careful with the cultures and not make assumptions. So like if you have a black deaf person that's, you know, in counseling or something, make sure that they have an interpreter that meshes well with them and understands their signing and their culture.
Right. So I actually want to add this question to close to that, just specifically on the cultural aspect. So why do you think it is so common in deaf culture to be blunt? And what is your opinion on people going to all deaf schools? What are the benefits and disadvantages?
I have sat and watched over the generations. My parents went to Ohio School for the Deaf, residential school. And I'm looking at today's students who are in special ed. I believe there are two major things that have caused a change in deaf society, deaf culture. The first thing is mainstreaming, making kids to want to stay in the local areas because their parents want them to be local. They don't want to send them away. And the idea of getting SSI, which is like, we've now got like third and fourth generation welfare going on. And so I think that when you are in a special ed program in one of the public school systems, 9 times out of 10, you are the only deaf child in that setting with a bunch of other people who have developmental issues. And a lot of the teachers do not know how to effectively communicate with a deaf child. Now, in the city of Canton, they have put together a group of deaf students from, I think it's K to 12, and there are 7, 8, 12, and so now you have peer-to-peer interaction going on. But when you have an isolated child out in some of these rural school areas, and they're the only ones there, their learning abilities have not progressed beyond 3rd grade, and they graduate. Now, when you go to a school like Ohio School for the Deaf, You're taught a lot of other things as well as vocational skills. So that's an issue that we face here I think throughout the 88 counties.
And I want to add to that. My parents, my mom, she went to school for the deaf in New York. And my dad, he grew up in the public school system. And I can see the difference between the two of them. My mom, she's more well-adjusted, and she's more social, and she has more developmental skills, whereas my dad, still to this day, he's 89, but he still struggles with some things, with some socially appropriate norms, because growing up, he grew up oral. He didn't learn how to sign until he was 27. And so his communication is very limited. Although his language developed fine, he graduated from a hearing school, and he was a jeweler. He made jewelry. But then his personal growth level, having been in public schools as the only deaf kid, it was very hard for him to adjust to the real world, because he didn't have any peers that was on his level to grow with. And that was the issue. Myself, I went to a school for the deaf growing up. And then I spent 4 years in public schools as the only deaf child. And I had that socialization, but it was frustrating as far as communication, because I went to camp for 2 weeks where I was the only deaf person there. And it was very lonely. And I couldn't really talk to anyone except my interpreter. My best friend in high school was my interpreter. And who was going through a divorce and domestic violence. And I was 16. And he was spilling his guts to me about things, or she was spilling her guts to me about things, because her husband was beating her up. And that's just the way that it was for me. And when I went to the deaf college I went to, Gallaudet, I met so many other people that grew up very similar to me. And I grew as a person there, realizing that I wanted to work with deaf and hard of hearing people and kids and help them to be able to grow and adjust the way that they need to be, so that they could have someone they could talk to and relate to and share experiences with. And you were talking, part of the question was about deaf people being blunt. That's not a negative thing to deaf people. That's just who we are. And we just let people know the truth, because it's a waste of time sitting around shooting a breeze. We don't really do that. And so we're blunt because that's what we feel. And some of us are a bit much, and some of us are a little more appropriate with how we handle that, but it depends on how we were raised and how our parents were, and if we went to deaf school or if we were mainstream. And I wanted to share a little bit of a story about my daughter again. Okay, so at the time, I think my daughter was about 14, and she was going to counseling. And my daughter, of course, is very angry, and she's swearing at me, and I'm just like, I don't care. But the counselor got so upset, and it's like, you can't talk to your mom like that, and this and that. And so she stopped giving us services because of my daughter's attitude towards me, because she didn't like how my daughter spoke to me. And I said, well, that's not your decision. That would be my decision as the mother to make. And if I'm okay with it, and that's my family dynamic, I mean, my husband and I, we swore a lot. And we had potty mouths, so you can only imagine, I mean, now I'm polite and appropriate, but at home with my daughter, like, it was different. We cussed at each other, and we didn't take it personally. That's just how we were. So, don't involve your personal opinions with your counseling clients, because you don't know how things might be for them at home and what's acceptable to their parents. And another thing, my fiance, he went to a deaf school in North Carolina, and I was mainstreamed in schools. And I did some international traveling too. And like, my mom was like my personal therapist. She was my teacher, and she did everything with me. So you can imagine, like, his best friend was his interpreter. My best friend was my mom. So, that's just how my life was. And it's like, hey, Mom, I want to call this boy. And so she would sit down and call him for me. And it was a little awkward. and I was about 13 or 14, having my mom interpreting for me over the phone and telling people that she liked them for me. And that's just something that deaf people have to deal with and have to go through to get our points across and get what we want. So just think about how it feels, put yourself in our shoes. And what was the other part of the question again? And about the deaf school. How do we feel about the deaf schools? My fiance has 2 deaf kids. And they go to a hearing school here in Stark County. And my fiance, he doesn't like that. They go to a hearing school because it's not the same, and they're not getting, that full cultural immersion and experience being with deaf students and teachers. And it's not the same when you're deaf and you have deaf family, or you're deaf and you have hearing family and you're not around a lot of other deaf people. But see, when you're at the school for the deaf, everyone signs because you have to, and you have more opportunity with sports. And those 2 girls, they want to play volleyball or soccer or swim or something. Maybe they want to be cheerleaders, but they can't because they go to a hearing school and it's set up to pick the best. And that's usually all of the hearing kids. But at the deaf school, like, anyone that wants to do something, they have equal opportunity to do it and compete. And so that's one of the reasons why deaf schools might be a better option for some deaf kids. It just depends on the familial environment. And it's like, I was told I missed out on not being at a deaf school, but how can I miss out on something I never had the opportunity to experience? And, ASL is my second language because English was my first. And I feel like there's a bit of a lag with me when I, sign, but now I'm very efficient and proficient at it, but I still feel like I'm not the same as, a deaf person that went to a deaf school. I feel like they might be better signers, and I'm more of a lazy signer. Like, I'm thinking English, but I'm trying to sign in ASL, and so I noticed that within myself sometimes. It's like people tell me, oh my gosh, you're so hearing, and it's like, okay, but everyone's different. So, does anyone else have anything to add to that?
Well, so next question is, what do you suggest for hearing people when we are in a position of witnessing oppression, such as when an agency won't allow you to use the same interpreter?
I don't understand it. Can you repeat it again?
I can read.
We have tried to tell our deaf clients and our deaf friends, you need to advocate for yourselves. A lot of times they're sort of afraid to be in this big hearing world, but they need to stand up and say, no, 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 we're not going to do that. And we have to keep teaching them to sort of stand up and speak for themselves and saying, I want the same interpreter. You need to call this agency. I will not do this. One of the problems that we have with deaf people is that when they sit there, when you and I, as hearing people, have a conversation, we go like this, uh-huh, uh-huh. When a deaf person is sitting there, we have this, what we call the famous deaf nod. They sort of nod their head, uh-huh, uh-huh. And then I get the provider saying, see, they understand. They're nodding their head. They get it. They don't need to have this, this, and this. The deaf person sometimes gives false impressions. Laura here, you heard her speak. She's deaf. Some people will look at her and say, she doesn't need interpreters when she goes to court and stuff like that. She can hear.
Yeah, I must have an interpreter for those kind of things.
These people have to advocate for themselves. They have to then come to somebody like John and myself in our agencies where then we can help take over the advocacy. I will tell you the majority of the things I do is advocating because the hearing world just does not understand deaf, hard of hearing, and especially deaf-blind.
Next.
And to add to that, real quick, deaf people tend to get referred to hearing people or someone else to take care of them because they're afraid, because they feel like I might make a mistake or mess something up. And it's like, you do this, I don't want to have to deal with it. And my mother-in-law was that way. She had just graduated from Ohio School for the Deaf. She took everything, they could take care of everything for her. Her father took care of everything. Like, oh no, I'll take care of you. She didn't know how to ride a bike. She didn't know how to swim. And she was a deaf girl, but she didn't learn how to do anything. But now, what does she do? She comes to my house with a stack of her bills and junk mail, and she's asking us, what is this? What is that? And it's like, you know, you have to decide what you're going to do with that yourself. Just like in the hospital, you know, deaf people do the deaf nod, and nurse or doctor think they understand just fine. And then you ask them to explain what they just said, and then if they try to, it's like, they can't explain it because they didn't know what they were just said. And a lot of deaf people do that, and it's up to us to make sure that we help them become independent, to be able to make their own decisions instead of following us.
All right, the next question is, unless she needs to add something.
The question was more specific on if you saw a question, what to do. If you see a question, stop it. That's what you do.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Or try to.
Good. Is sign language different in another language? So I'm guessing that would be for a person who speaks Spanish, or in the Spanish countries, like, is sign language different for them?
Yes. For example, I have an interpreter, and I can gesture, and I just made a sign in another language asking for an interpreter. Like, different places have different signs. It depends on where you live. For example, in Japan, they're more abstract. And in Europe, they're more gestural. And then the languages can influence each other, and sometimes it's pretty similar, sometimes it's different, even in the US. And depending on the region, signs can be different. Like chicken. And these are all signs for chicken. It just depends on where you live. And just like these are all signs for birthday. You know, that's just and that's all within the US, just depending on where you're from. In another country, it'll be different too. So like in Columbus, we have 2 large communities, Somali, and they have different signs. And sometimes they bring things from their country, sometimes they have home signs they made up themselves, and it can be different.
And just like any other foreign language, sentence structures are different. You know, ASL, when I tell people that you need to have an ASL person, they says, well, they use English, and I says, yeah. He said, well, where are they coming from, Mars or someplace like that? And that's an insensitive person. But the structure of like ASL, it's not like noun, verb, object like you and I do. It's backwards. A lot of it is about, you know, context and verbs. And in foreign languages, like when you speak in Spanish or when you speak in French, it's not exactly how we speak here. So the sentence structures are much different too.
I'm going to ask a fun question before we end. If I don't get to the last 2 questions, I'm going to send this as an email to the panelists, and then once we get their response, we'll send it out to everyone, just to make sure that all questions are answered for. But I had someone ask me a very interesting question. What writers and or artists have captured the essence of deaf and hard of hearing culture?
Well, my favorite one is Helen Keller. Helen Keller is, you all knew who Helen Keller is, right? Helen Keller's my favorite term from her, she says, blindness separates us from things, deafness separates us from people. And she wrote, she was an author, and she affected some other people who were around her in a cultural way. So she's a key person.
And to add to that, Chuck Bard, he's a famous painter and artist, and he uses his hands and hand shapes to make like different animals, and he paints different things and makes beautiful art. You can look him up and see his work. He's got a lot of things that relate to the deaf community, and he's got performances like improv and comedy and expressive poetry, visual poetry, and he's got some very beautiful stuff on YouTube. You can look him up. Dandelion. It's a very beautiful story about oppression in the deaf community. And Dandelion is a deaf person in a deaf community, and hearing people are spraying weed killer, and there's people that wrote and drew things that was part of the story. And there was a book by Mark Drolsbo from Pennsylvania, and he wrote about his experiences growing up in mainstream schools. It's a wonderful book too.
Last one, because we are to close.
And one book that I really, really like is written by an author from England, Ireland, and it's so wonderful because it encourages all of us who struggle with who we are and how we identify with ourselves with colonialism and being controlled by, hearing people. And sorry, I'm a little bit radical, but it really opened my eyes. It woke me up to who I am as a deaf person. And I used to talk a lot more, but now I let my interpreters talk for me. I can talk great, I just refuse not to. I feel like I'm done communicating the way that I'm expected to by hearing people. I'm forcing you to meet me halfway to communicate with me, so.
I'm going to have to close because it's already 12:01, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. This has been great conversation, and I will try to get to the questions, and there was a comment too about a documentary that I can also share through email. I would like to first thank our speaker, John Moore, for being such an amazing, bringing such an amazing presentation, and all our panelists for sharing their stories. If we can give them an applaud. And thank you, everyone, for coming to our population-focused learning series. I hope this event has brought some awareness of the deaf and hard of hearing culture and community. Please fill out your survey, and you may leave them on the table as you go. Please look at our StarkMHAR website for more information about the rest of our population-focused learning series 2020, and save the dates. So you can sign up now and save them on your calendars. It will be about the veteran community, and unconscious bias is coming up. So please sign up. And our next training sessions will be that will be coming up for the veterans will be in June. Thank you all again for being here, and enjoy the coming up spring.